You've probably heard preachers say something about the power of God, or hear people talk about, man, it was a display of the power of God, and we believe in the power of God. What exactly is the power of God? What does it look like? How does it work? I'm glad you asked those questions, because I would like for us to talk about that very subject today on this edition of Theology Thursday, the power of God. Now, before we actually talk about the power of God, I want to be honest and give some credit where credit is due. There was a man who lived in the 19th century, in the 1800s, named James Pettigrew Boyce. He came from an extremely wealthy family. He felt there was the need for a seminary, which is a graduate school for pastors. And so he founded a seminary for his denomination, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which was originally in South Carolina and then was later relocated to Louisville, Kentucky, where it still exists today. And so Boyce wrote in 1887 this book called An Abstract of Systematic Theology. And for many years, this was the textbook in the theology classes at Southern Seminary, classes that he taught, and then eventually others would teach after him. He really liked the word abstract because in addition to this, he also wrote what's called the Abstract of Principles, which is the doctrinal statement for that seminary that all professors, even to this day, are required to sign that they agree with it. And so this is a great book. Obviously, it's old. It's 150 years old. But, theology doesn't go out of style, does it? Now, the reason I tell you that is because in this book, he actually has a chapter on the power of God. And so much of the material that I'm going to share with you today isn't something that I've come up with. It comes out of this book. So I want to be sure to give credit to Dr. Boyce for the work that he did and for leaving it in print for subsequent generations such as ours to learn from this very brilliant man. So with that said, let's just kind of dive in and talk about the power of God, or God's power. First of all, let's talk about a definition. And again, I'm going to lean on Boyce. Power in God, therefore, may be defined to be the effective energy inherent in his nature, by which he is able to do all things. The exercise of that power is dependent on his will or purpose, and is limited not by what he can do, but by what he chooses to do. Okay? So that's I like that definition because it's something that's inherent in God, by which God does what he does. So basically it's a demonstration of God's ability and capability, not something he gets from outside, but is inherent to himself. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that God's power is in two kind of locations. One is God's absolute power, which is equivalent to what he can do and is measured by his nature. So that's God's absolute power. That's what God can do. Then we have his actual power, which is what he exercises. That's what he actually does, and it's measured by his will. It is what is put into action by him. And so what we see here in these definitions is that God's power is absolute. That's like, we use the word reservoir, even though you can empty a reservoir and God's reservoir would never go empty, but that's what God could do, that's which is infinite. Then we have his actual power, which is what it sounds like, what God actually does. And so God's will determines what he does. God's nature determines what he can do. So God's nature determines his absolute power, which is infinite. His will determines his actual power, which is what he uses to accomplish that will in all the universe and everything that exists. Okay? Now, you and I also have power. So one of the ways to kind of understand God's power is to understand how it differs from our power. So let's talk about those. First of all, we cannot do whatever we choose, even if it's right. So, for example, even if it's the right thing to do, you and I can't fly up and catch a plane that's falling out of the sky. Like, we don't have the power to do that. So there is a limit to what we can do. No, you and I have absolute power, but it's limited, unlike God's. A second thing that differs with our power is that we cannot do it without intermediate means. Now, here's what that means. That means that you and I, when we do something, usually have to use something. We'll use energy that we have acquired by eating. We oftentimes have to use tools to accomplish something. Like, we can't do it without tools. You and I can't cut down a tree without a saw or an axe or something. We have to, it requires an intermediate means or something between us and the goal. God, on the other hand, can just do it directly. He doesn't need an intermediate means of doing so. And we see this most clearly in the creation account. God speaks and it happens. He doesn't have to use something. He can. He uses dirt to make Adam. He uses a rib to make Eve. But it's not necessary for God to do that. For you and me, it's usually necessary for us to use some kind of intermediate means. And then the third one is, we cannot do it at any moment we please, but only when the circumstances favor. In other words, and I guess this makes sense, if I'm asleep, I can't do it. Sometimes I can't do things because it's unfavorable. So let's go back to our chop down the tree illustration. Even if I have the intermediate means, I've got an axe. There are times when I could not go cut down a tree. If you lived on the Gulf Coast and there's a hurricane, you can get blown away before you can cut down that tree. You may be up north and it's bitter cold and you can't get outside at that time to do it. Perhaps the tree is on someone else's property and so you're not able to cut it down. Maybe the tree is on a property line and so you have to get permission from your neighbor, or an agreement. Or maybe the tree is considered a historical landmark and so you're not able to cut it down without a permit from the city or something. And so you and I cannot just do it when we want to do it. We have to wait until the circumstances or conditions are favorable. So God can do whatever He wants. He has the power to do it. God can do it directly, doesn't need any kind of intermediary, and God can do it whenever He wants. And so that is a contrast between God's power and our power. Now, because it is the power of God, that means that there are some things that His nature precludes Him from doing. So let me see if I can show you what that looks like. There are at least 8 things that God will not do, or cannot. I don't like to use the word cannot, but God just simply can't do, really, because of His nature. Okay? So, for example, God cannot create a being or a world to which His essential, incommunicable attributes can be given, okay? Such as infinity, eternity, immensity, self-existence. Now, what is that? Well, God's attributes can be divided into communicable and incommunicable, meaning there are things that are attributes of God that He can communicate or give to us. So love, forgiveness, grace, justice, many of these attributes of God, you and I, God's communicated them to us. We can have them. But you and I cannot be eternal, because eternal requires no beginning and no end. And all of us have a beginning. Now, we're not going to have an end, but all of us have a beginning. And so there are things like that they belong to God, and He can't communicate them to us because it's an impossibility, because His nature is such that that's not going to happen. Okay? He cannot create a being whose nature is sinful. So even though Satan is the father of all lies and the father of sin, Satan was not created sinful. Satan was an angel, and then he became sinful on his own. And so, there's no God cannot make directly a being that is sinful. Okay? He cannot impose laws which are not accordant with his righteousness and holiness. That makes sense. God's not going to pass a law that says you have to lie, or you have to steal, or you have to murder. I guess that's kind of obvious. God cannot deal with any of his creatures unjustly because God's nature is just. Everything that he does is just. He cannot do what is unjust. He cannot commit sin because of his nature. He might have the power to do so, but never the will to do so. And so God's absolute power might allow him to sin, but his actual power would never allow him to, because his actual power is an expression of his will, which is an expression of his nature and his character. So because he has a righteous nature, he has a righteous character, he has a righteous will, therefore everything he does is righteous. He cannot do unrighteousness because of his nature and character. Okay? He cannot change his own nature. God can't decide to not be God. He cannot change his decrees or his purpose. So once God had determined to send Jesus, it was going to happen. God didn't go, oops, that was a mistake, I'm not going to do that. Like, God's never going to change any of that. And then lastly, God cannot do impossibilities. Now, you go, what do you mean God cannot do impossibilities? Well, there's this whole question, can God make a rock that's too big for him to lift? Can God make an immovable object and have it run into an irresistible force? And it's that kind of thing. So God can't do impossibilities like that. Things that, because once again, they go against his nature, or because they're silly questions. They're just silly and nonsensical and unnecessary. Now, one of the arguments against the power of God, or an objection that's often raised, is the presence of sin in the universe. The holiness, justice, even the goodness of God seem to make it impossible that sin could be even allowed into the universe. God hates sin. God punishes sin when it appears. So either sin is due to the fact that God could not prevent it, or that he has permitted it for some wise purpose beyond what we can always understand. Now, whatever that wise purpose is, it should be shown to that the existence of evil is still consistent with God's goodness. Somehow, God in his goodness has permitted evil to accomplish his ultimate plan and purpose. That does not mean God approves of it, but that God does use it. And I'll show you how this works in a second. God, if he didn't want sin in the universe, could have created creatures that were not capable of sinning. He could have placed them in circumstances where they would have never sinned. He could have sustained them and given them his actual power in those circumstances to have victory over sin, which he does even for believers today. Or he could have immediately destroyed those who sinned. He could have immediately destroyed Satan. But no, God uses sin to display his power. So let's look at that. How does God use sin to display his power? Well, by at least 4 different ways. One is God's power is shown over sin itself. Its destruction and punishment that we know is eventually going to happen. God's power over sin, its final victim, by causing them to feel and acknowledge the terrible power of his wrath. So God uses sin to show his justice and his wrath against sin. Without sin, we would never know that attribute or characteristic of God. Third, over others, by their signal deliverance through his power, not only from the penalty, but from the very presence of sin. In other words, salvation. If there was no sin, there would be no salvation. So we would not know about the redemption and the grace and the forgiveness and all those things of God if he had not permitted sin to enter into the universe. And then lastly, sin displays the power of God in the sin itself by exhibiting the restraining and conquering power by which God makes evil itself to work out his power of good and glory. And so God uses sin, I know it sounds crazy, but uses it to show his power. Let me give you the ultimate example of that. It is sinful to lie and wrongfully, intentionally convict an innocent man. It is a sin to execute that man. It is a sin to mock and humiliate him in public. And yet that's exactly what happened to Jesus. He was falsely accused in a rigged trial. He was mocked and beaten and stripped and all that. And then he was crucified. He was executed. God used all of that sin that was done by the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders and the soldiers and all of them. God used all of that to accomplish his purpose of salvation. So the power of God is demonstrated sometimes by the way he orchestrates things, even sin, to accomplish his purpose, but it still doesn't negate the fact that it's sin. You say, wow, man, that's heavy. I know it's heavy. It makes my head hurt. But he's God, so his head never hurts over it. But just think about it, that the power of God is so great and so intricate and so perfect that God's power can be demonstrated even through the presence of sin in our universe to accomplish his will and his purpose and his plan. So the next time you think about the power of God, think about some of these things, but most of all, think about the fact that God has absolute power that he demonstrates through his will, even in things that don't seem good or not good, like sin and evil. God still, by his power, will use them to accomplish his purpose and his will. And there's nothing, and there is no one that will ever be able to thwart the purpose of God, because his power is infinite and almighty and absolute. So God bless you. Man, celebrate today that we serve a God of infinite power, but also wise and good power. God bless you.